Can you imagine being held captive for 18 years? That is exactly what happened to this woman. She was an innocent young girl with a bright future when a sick psychopath abducted her one day. What occurred next was something out of a nightmare, but fortunately she is still alive to tell the tale. Jaycee Lee Duggard was a shy, timid, and people-pleaser. She adored her family and especially her baby sister Shayna. Her family was her whole world. However, her stepdad and her were not really close, but they got along. In the year 1990, Jaycee and her family moved to South Lake Tahoe, California, after they got robbed in Orange County. They had hoped that the small and quiet community would be a safer place to live in. However, that quickly changed on June 10, 1991. Jaycee woke up early and got ready for school. She was in the 5th grade at the time, and she was most worried about an approaching field trip. She put on her favorite all-pink attire and proceeded to the school bus stop up the hill from her house. But halfway there, a gray automobile drew up next to her. At first, Jaycee thought that the man in the car would just ask for directions. But little did she know, he had other things planned. The man pulled up next to her, rolled down his window, and tased her with a stun gun. The accomplice of the man got out of the car and dragged Jaycee inside the car. While Jaycee was being dragged into the car, her stepdad watched in horror and panicked and tried to find his car keys, but they were nowhere to be found. He hopped onto a bicycle nearby, desperately wanting to save Jaycee, but it was too late to stop the kidnappers. They were gone. So he hurried home and called the police. 911? This is 911. On Vineyard Boulevard, my daughter was just kidnapped. Top of the hill, it was a gray Ford, a man and a woman in the car. When the police arrived, the witnesses, like some of her classmates, were interviewed about the incident. The police were able to get a description of the car and the woman, and so the investigation commenced. Jaycee's biological dad, Ken Slayton, was the first suspect, but was quickly cleared out. The police found out Ken did not even know that Jaycee existed, and the relationship he had with Jaycee's mom was short-lived. He wasn't even informed that she was pregnant. Who then took Jaycee, and why? The hunt for Jaycee started right away, and the police and neighborhood volunteers searched to look for the gray automobile in the town. They exhausted every resource they could find to help them locate Jaycee. Time was of the essence. There were roadblocks set up by the police, and they even went door to door in the neighborhood. Tens of thousands of flyers and posters were posted and mailed out around the United States in hopes of someone having information about Jaycee, or at least have seen her. The neighborhood was covered in pink ribbons as a way of showing support for her devastated family. Her mom, Terry, made a group called Jaycee's Hope. It directed search efforts and volunteer work. Along with the volunteer work, they also sold items like cassette tapes of the song Jaycee Lee, and also shirts, sweatshirts, and buttons to raise money for poster materials and postage printing and other expenses that aids to find Jaycee. Child Quest International and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were involved in the case. They even offered a reward to anyone who had any information about Jaycee's whereabouts. The case has attracted so much attention that it was even featured in the TV show America's Most Wanted. As months passed and later turned into years, eventually everyone's lives started to move on. But despite this, Jaycee's mom never gave up, and she kept holding fundraising events and candlelight vigils to remind the public to keep searching for her daughter. It went on for 18 years. I'll never stop loving her or missing her, and I want her home, Terry, Jaycee's mom, stated. A man who goes by the name Philip Greg Gordino was a perverted man who held Jaycee captive. He spent time in prison after he kidnapped and violated a young woman in a warehouse for 5.5 hours. The police were able to rescue the woman. When they were passing by, they noticed a car parked outside the unit and saw the broken lock of the warehouse. When Philip emerged, a woman was crying for help. Philip was promptly charged, detained, and charged again. He was found guilty and given a 50-year prison sentence. Even when Philip was locked up, he was able to convince another woman by the name of Nancy to marry him. His wife was a nurse aide and had an uncle locked up in the same prison Philip was in. She married Philip because she fell in love with him and even helped him obtain parole after persuading everyone that Philip had changed and merited a second chance. Philip served 11 years and later was on parole, which was a big mistake. We all know Philip was a big pervert. Why did Nancy do that? Accept participation in the situation. Well, Nancy is not as innocent as you may think. Nancy was just as twisted and evil as her husband. The authorities later discovered videos showing her recording Philip playing guitar in a park while focusing in on the nearby children playing, perhaps in search of potential victims. When the two sick couples kidnapped Jaycee, she was brought into their home and was hidden in a tiny soundproof shed in the backyard. Jaycee was also put into handcuffs and was locked up in the shed, warning that dogs were outside if she ever tried to run. Later on in her life, Jaycee wrote a book about her captivity and mentioned Philip would go on runs and take drugs and later torture and violate her for hours. After, Philip would tell her he's doing all these things to her so he wouldn't have to do it to other girls. And as Jaycee gives him what he wants, she is saving others. Not a day that I didn't cry. I felt there would never be a day that I wouldn't cry again. To help her pass time, Jaycee would look out the window and watch the moonlight and think about her mom and just reminisce how her mother preferred the crescent, while she always preferred the full moon, and how they would argue about which was better. What's really intriguing is that her mother was actually engaging in the same activity at home, forging a connection between them. At some point, Philip had brought a TV for her. She was allowed to watch anything but the news. Philip didn't want her to know that people out there were searching for her. He wanted Jaycee to know that he was her only companion and stripped her of her hopes that someone cares for her. Philip would torture and violate her and after would sob and beg for her forgiveness. 7 months have passed. Philip thought it was right to introduce Jaycee to Nancy. Nancy was playing nice with Jaycee. She would bring her stuffed toys and occasionally chocolate milk and even apologized for her husband's behavior. Jaycee was unaware of Nancy's nature and had no idea that she was just as twisted as her husband. Jaycee thought she could have Nancy on her side and tried everything she could to make her like her, hoping one day Nancy might set her free. While Nancy acted all motherly to Jaycee, she had times where she would turn into this really mean and cruel person. At the age of 14 years old, Jaycee gave birth to her first daughter all on her own, and at the age of 17, she had a second daughter. Despite her situation, her children became her strongest motivation to keep going and fighting for freedom. At one point, Philip was able to convince Jaycee that life without him would be a disaster. I was conditioned to think the outside world was a scary place, and the only place I was safe and my girls were safe was to stay with their dad. He always took care of everything, and he always had an answer for everything. One of the reasons I stayed was I wanted my kids to be safe. Sooner or later, Philip had allowed Jaycee some freedom. She was now able to walk to the store, the park, and the beach with her daughters. To avoid people being suspicious, Philip told Jaycee to teach her daughters to refer to Nancy as their mom and her as their older sister. No one was able to notice, and the lie went on for a very long time. Philip had his own business, which was a print shop, and Jaycee would work as a graphic designer. Jaycee was able to handle business and was handling phone calls and emails. She would search online for lesson plans to help her homeschooled daughters. She was able to meet and interact with different customers, but no one knew the horror back home. Some of the people who'd visit Philip in his house said they'd seen Jaycee, but they had no clue who she was. The neighbors would also see Jaycee's daughters in the backyard. People found them unusual, but they were unable to comprehend what was actually happening. What frustrates a lot of people about the case is that there were numerous opportunities for Jaycee to be saved. There was this time Philip caught Jaycee talking to the neighbor boy through the fence and was able to tell him who she was. After that encounter, Philip built an 8-foot-tall fence around the backyard and set up a tent for her. Another time Jaycee could have been rescued was when police officers would visit Philip's house at least twice a month but failed to discover the happening in the backyard. You can actually hear Nancy, Philip's wife, trying to speak on this video to divert a policeman from his investigation of the premises. What does a parole agent do for his parolee? Ma'am, you can come into the office, we'll discuss that at an appropriate time. Then again, in year 2006, a neighbor had called the police to report about the tents in Philip's backyard and the children living there. The neighbor mentioned Philip was psychotic with sexual addictions. A deputy sheriff came by and talked to Philip. After explaining to Philip that it would be a code violation if individuals were living outside of his property for more than 30 minutes, the deputy sheriff left. On top of being a creep, Philip was also insane and had delusions that he was a chosen servant of God and had the ability to control sound with his mind. He ran a blog for the organization he called God's Desire Church and asked followers to sign testimonies attesting to his mental control over sound. On August 24, 2009, Philip left a 4-page essay at the FBI office in San Francisco. In his letter, he was raving about his religion and sexuality beliefs. He also talked about him discovering a cure for his criminal sexual behaviors and how that information could be used to help others like him. On the same day, he went to a University of California police officer and asked them to hold a special event on campus for his God's Desire program. Philip came along with his 2 daughters to the event. Things started to get interesting. While Philip was preaching passionately about his beliefs and powers, there were 2 female police officers who found the girls odd. They were just standing next to Philip and were not as interactive and passionate as he was. Soon, the officers ran a background check on Philip, and what they discovered validated what their gut had been telling them. They found out he was a criminal offender on parole and had nothing to do with the 2 young girls. The campus cop gave Philip's parole officer a call, and that is when it started to unravel. Philip told his parole officer that was being accompanied by his wife Nancy, Jaycee, and the 2 girls. Jaycee was introduced as Alyssa and his relative, and said she gave permission to Philip to go with her daughters to the event in the university. After the event, his parole officer decided to separate Philip from the women and girls to learn more about what is going on. What was really interesting was when they separated from Philip. Jaycee still went on with her false identity as Alyssa and continued with the lies Philip fed her. Whenever she was asked if she knew of Philip's past as a convicted offender, she would defend him and say that he has changed and was a great person and great with kids. This just shows how much control Philip had over Jaycee. Later on suggested that Jaycee showed signs of Stockholm Syndrome, which is when victims bond with abusers or captors. During an interview with ABC News, it was strongly denied by Jaycee. She mentioned her only means of surviving were her kindness and eagerness to engage with Philip. Really, it's degrading, you know, having my family believe that I was in love with this captor and wanted to stay with him. I mean, that is so far from the truth that it makes me want to throw up. Later on, Philip confessed all his doings to Jaycee, and that was when Jaycee stopped being Alyssa and wrote down her real name, Jaycee Lee Duggard. She mentioned in her book that the evil spell on her had been broken. Jaycee was soon reunited with her mom, and imagine how happy they were. They cried and laughed and held each other. Philip pleaded guilty of his charges, and he was sentenced to 41 years in prison, and Nancy got 36 years to life in prison. Jaycee is now reunited with her mom and daughters, and despite her experiences, she made the decision to move on and concentrate on improving her life. Thank you for watching. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit the like button as well as the subscribe button.